The second of our American cultural landscapes / built environment is the Wild West. Now, you have all sorts of other landscapes regionally. So, in the South, you have basically the plantation landscape, and in places like Louisiana, you have sort of the shotgun Creole landscape. So, there's all sorts of regional landscapes, but they don't really become central to American identity. For all their, spectacular looks, Southern plantation homes never really become part and parcel of the American world in the way that you see it, for example, in subdivisions. If you remember the Palo Alto street that we were looking at, you don't see a lot of reference to it. So you always find regional landscapes, but what we're talking about here is where the landscapes that actually become part of American identity. And so you'll see parts referred to and borrowed into the contemporary world we live in. The next of these for us in North America would be the Wild West town. Now, I should point out this one is radically different, but it has to do with many of the same aspects. Even more so, what it's doing is it's emphasizing migration. The difference is migration earlier. The New England migration was migration to build stable communities and farms and settle in and have your future there. And so in that regard, what you're doing is you're making sort of if you would, a variation of what you would see in Europe with a settled rural village or town. But it was in a new place and had different symbolic aspects, but the logic was sort of the same. What happens though, starting in the 1700s, is this push for migration. First, initially, is moving farms west. So the move up the Ohio River Valley from the East Coast. So you move westward for the purposes of recreating, if you would, that New England landscape, or at least a farming landscape. As you move into the plains, that becomes radically different, as we'll see, because you leave the forested eastern part of the United States and you move into the much sort of larger expanses of the list soil plains region, which is an entirely different type of farming, which you're not going to have in Europe because you don't have list soils. So it's the first, what you might call sort of unique environmental landscape. But what you also find then is in this idea of, if you want, the Calvinist Puritan towns, so flashback to the Williamsburg image, what you find is there's going to be a certain component of folks who have migrated to North America, who have migrated to the United States, since we're now talking about a period when the United States is now a country, but they're not really attracted to a New England landscape. The structure, the centrality of the group, which always was sort of, if you think about it, sort of antithesis, or sort of a dialectic in Calvinism, is on one hand you have this idea of the community. Williamsburg as a classic case in point, but on the other hand, you also have Calvinism is very, very entirely focused on the rights of individuals. So if you think of Williamsburg, the Calvinist view of Williamsburg would be a bunch of people of shared mind and attitudes living in the same place. But if you're not of the same attitude, or you don't get accepted by the group, then you're going to have to go somewhere else. And in the American ethos of the 19th and even 20th century, that was moving west. So what you find is a subset of this is then people sort of split into two groups. One group, you move west to basically, make a new permanent life of it, a farm, or maybe we'll see a ranch or something like that. But nonetheless, you're basically moving for the same logic that people left Europe to move to North America. However, there's going to be another group of people that have decided that, given the enormous resources available in North America that are totally not available in Europe, that rather than moving someplace to make it a house and make it a home and make it a community, what you do is you move someplace to basically exploit it, if you would, work the land to take the resources and the wealth out of the land. And that becomes the huge mining logic of the sort of the stereotype of the American Western states, is the idea of mining, taking resources, whether it be coal, whether it be gold, whether it be silver, whatever it is. But you take the resources, or you exploit and extract. In fact, that's a really fascinating word. You extract the resources out of that landscape, and then you leave that landscape. So this is not a landscape that you're going to stay in permanently. This is very much what you might call a disposable landscape. You go there, you modify it in whatever way that you need to extract whatever it is you want out of it, and then you just leave it. And this is something that's very striking if you go to the American West, is these enormous landscapes all around you, especially say northern Nevada, which I'm most familiar with, where you'll just go and you'll all of a sudden see this huge open pit mine that's been abandoned for 30, 50, 70 years. This huge hole in the ground that in many cases used to be a hill. So it's not just a couple 100 feet down, it's also maybe, plus 300-foot hill. You've lost the hill and you've gone 300 feet down. So you've got this huge pit, and when the company's done with it, they just walk from it. So you've got this huge hole in the ground. These are huge environmental issues, not least of all. But they're also, more importantly, they're very much the American attitude about the idea of place. If domestication of nature is part of the New England world, then extraction of resources and wealth from nature and having no worry about the consequences is very much what you might call the Western world. It's still very much part of the Western United States view of themselves. The quintessential example of this, as we'll see, at least in my view, would be Virginia City, because it's not only one of the earliest examples, but it's by far one of the most spectacular. So let's take a look here real quick. Okay, so here's Main Street in Virginia City. I did a little bit of work back in the early mid-70s looking at some of the mining. Virginia City is, if you're not familiar, it's a fascinating place. It's originally what they were looking for became called the Comstock lode. So back in the 1840s, folks that were poking around, because they already found, of course, gold in California, so they figured if there's gold in California, there should be gold in other places. They came further north, basically south of Reno, and they were poking around here, and they found a very spectacular vein, basically a conglomeration of precious metals. The stone, if you see it, I actually have a sample, but we don't have an office anymore. The sample, if you look at the actual Comstock lode, it's this real sort of peculiar dove blue gray color, but it has a fairly high concentration of gold in it. So miners started to come out here and extract the gold from this rock that's in veins and buried in the ground. One of the peculiar aspects of the Comstock lode is it actually pops up. In fact, if you look in the distance here, I think it's right about here, which is actually one of the areas where the Comstock lode popped up to the surface. That's how they were able to find it. And then, of course, they started burrowing in the ground following that lode to dig the minerals out of it. They weren't interested in the area around it. They just wanted the minerals. Very quickly, they were getting upset because the blue-gray material that the gold was in was causing trouble for the extraction process until someone had that assayed or tested and realized it was almost pure silver. And at that point, the Comstock lode became the first, massive silver rush in the United States. If the Eastern California area had been the gold rush of 1846, 1848, the Comstock very quickly entirely surpassed that. And especially because this area is pretty brutal. If you're actually looking at it, I like it, but it's not exactly a warm and fuzzy landscape. This is what the area sort of looks like, though. It's one of, again, the sort of shocking aspects is this whole area was actually in forest and pinyon pine and other forested trees, largely pine trees. Every single pine tree for literally 100 miles around Virginia City was cut down. Every single tree was cut down to use for firewood, either to keep people warm, but actually people would oftentimes almost freeze to death because you needed the fire to basically heat up steam to work the processing plants to extract the silver. So people would actually almost freeze to death to make sure that they got the silver processed, which says something about the sort of mindset that you had in this area. So this whole hillside would have been in trees, but they were entirely gone. In fact, even sagebrush was gone here in the mid 1800s. You burned everything you get your hands on, because otherwise you literally you wouldn't wake up in the morning, you freeze to death. It gets very commonly in the winter, it gets to 15, 20 below zero here. And so, you can very easily freeze overnight. Since for the first 4 or 5 years, the vast majority of people lived in tents. So this was entirely a migrant community. People came here for the sole purpose of digging in these hills and taking everything out of those hills that was worth money. And when they were done with that, they were gone. No one was planning to ever stay here. And this is why you see the sort of classic Western phenomena of the ghost town, the town which was basically one of these points or areas of extraction. And when the extraction's done, then, everyone, their brothers are out of here. In fact, this one got just a shot. This whole area here, for example, is actually the tailings from the mine. So there's two mines. I think there's one over here and one up here. As they dug out the ground underneath, all the leftover dirt from the tunnels and stuff was dumped out here. And also that's where they processed the ore. So everything you see here is actually from underground. So this whole landscape is entirely changed, entirely modified by human action, purely for the purpose of mineral extraction, no other function to it. And so Virginia City becomes one of the first of the mining camps, the mining towns. And its sole function was to provide the services that the miners needed to survive, the stuff to buy to eat, to live on, the clothing, and the stuff to escape the horrendous, nature of the life they were living, which meant that every third building along in Virginia City initially was a saloon, or we call them bars now, I guess. But all this place was temporary. And part of that is because you think about this building here, for example, every piece of wood you put in that building is wood that you're not putting in a boiler to extract silver, which is your reason for being there. So a lot of these places for the first couple of years had canvas roofs because, it was cheaper. And also you have to remember everything in Virginia City had to be shipped largely from San Francisco over basically on the backs of horses, pack mules, or in wagons. So everything you see here, if it's from the early period, and these buildings are from the early period, this one is actually about 1855, I think, 1860 maybe. These buildings all were basically imported. They were brought in many cases, pre-cut. So they're basically an early version of prefab, brought in for the purpose of putting up a more substantial structure here. But everything was temporary. Nothing in Virginia City was intended to last, because people didn't plan on being there very long. They thought they would be there for a year or two, 3 years, 5 years, till they struck it rich. And then they were gone. And then they would move to places like San Francisco, and in many places, ironically, live in large versions of colonial structures, or copies, 1850s, mid and late 19th century versions of colonial buildings. Or if they were really wealthy, they'd live in late 19th century versions of basically Southern mansions, Southern plantation buildings, or copies of European mansions, because they had the wealth to do that. And you can still see a bunch of these in parts of San Francisco. So no one planned on staying in Virginia City. This in the modern sense, this would be a hotel. This was a temporary community for the purpose of serving the needs of the folks that were here, for the purpose of making money. And the minute they made money, boom, they were out of here. So everything here was almost like a movie set. Its function was very much minimum cost, maximum bang for your buck, and very little interest in long term. So if you think about it, a lot of this is pretty antithetical to the Calvinists. There's no idea, you're not really dominating nature. You're just, basically squeezing everything out of nature you want, and then wham, you're out of here. So it's not the same type of relationship with the world around you. And since everything's temporary, you're going to have the same sort of straight streets, but you're not going to have the idea of lawns, God knows. You're not going to have the idea of white picket fences and such like that. People just aren't into that here. You're not going to be here long enough to have a white picket fence. And you have to remember, to a certain extent, for a lot of folks here, white picket fences were part of the world they were trying to get out of. For whatever set of reasons, the New England logic, the Calvinist Puritan logic, was something they weren't a part of. And so this was a place that, between brothels and saloons, that's about 80% of your structures here for the first 10 years of its construction. And, it's all been cleaned up now. It's a national park, national historic site. But, basically this place was, modern Las Vegas is a very poor, very timid, modern interpretation of what Virginia City was back in the day. If you ever want to read it, go back and read Sam Clemens, you know him as Mark Twain, Roughing It, because he was actually a newspaper reporter here in Virginia City during the height of the gold and silver rush of the Comstock Lode. Part of the insanity was the Comstock Lode went under the town. They didn't know when they first put the town in. And so this whole town, and that's one of the things we were looking at, this whole town has got huge tunnels underneath it, 50, 100, 300, 500 feet underneath these buildings. There are tunnels, and people, like little moles, were digging out all the ore out of that. I mean, it used to be a real problem back in the other end of town, where all of a sudden some of these tunnels would collapse after they had been abandoned, and all of a sudden someone's house would disappear and fall, 80 feet into the ground. Very typical in the mining communities like Silverton or other places like that. Virginia City is not unique. Bodie's probably the most intact, but Virginia City is probably the most fascinating because in many ways it becomes the reference. In the same way that Williamsburg is the reference for the New England town, Virginia City becomes the reference for basically the Wild West. And so what you see, and this is, again, if we look at the symbols that make this up, you see the use of white, but in a rather intriguing way, and oftentimes almost very much slapped on, because the folks that lived here were from that New England heritage. They had been brought up in way, shape, or form in sort of a Calvinist world, So there were some attempts to sort of keep that. So, if you would, you might use the color white, but it wasn't done the same way, and it didn't serve the same function. You might put in trees or stuff like that, but again, they're pretty haphazard because no one was planning on being here long enough to watch the tree grow up. You had a temporary community that served functional needs. For example, wood for basically your flooring material for the sidewalks. Why? Because if it rotted out, you could change it, but also it was, wood was around until they got rid of it all. Wood was around. It was one of the few basic materials. Why would you put in flagstone? No one's going to be here long enough to enjoy it, so why waste your time? You're going to have glass, but initially not much. You would put in some churches. But again, this was to serve the occasional needs that people had, but this was not a church-going population. The churches were in the Midwest and the East. This was let's make a shitload of money, do it as quick as possible, and get the hell out to a really nice, comfortable place to live where you won't freeze your appendages off in the winter. And in the summer, average temperature, I think the hottest it got in winters there is at 106 or 108, which isn't unusual for this part of Nevada. But again, since you're at about 2,500 feet, that 108 really hits you because it's a higher elevation. So this place gets hot as crap in the summer, gets cold as hell in the winter. And so people were here not by choice. People didn't plan to live here. It's not an attractive environment for the classic sort of, Anglo-American placeholder. This is a place that you made money. And so what you find is there's all sorts of interesting aspects that refer to this making money part of it. I mean, still a little one there. Let's back up just a toot here so I can show you this a little bit better. Now you have to remember these folks are from the New England ethos. It's now, 100 years after Williamsburg, if you want to put it in context. But that's the world as Americans. That's the world that they grew up in. And whether they liked it or not, it's the world they're always going to contrast to compare themselves to. So what you did is you came up with these really fascinating aspects that looked like stability, that looked like success and getting ahead, like their Williamsburg counterparts, but they weren't. The classic that refers almost to stereotype of the Wild West or the Western community, certainly you see in the movies and stuff, would be here. This is what we call the false front. So the roof here, the roof line's actually in here. So what you do is you actually build a front, a pretentious, more fancy looking front to the structure. Notice how you've got three here that totally different. I mean, you're not worried about looking like your neighbor. What you want to look is spectacular. But you want to do it as cheap a cost because you're not going to be here very long. So everything is sort of cost first. How much is it going to expend? So the easiest way to do that, since the folks here are only going to see the front of the structure, is you put a false front on these buildings so they look more fancy than they are. And in doing so, you then make a more pretentious structure for almost no extra cost. And that's very, very much part of this Western mindset. Are you worried about it? No. What? People are going to go walk down here and go, oh, this is totally fake. Look at the fake roof. You don't care. You're only going to be here long enough to make a lot of money and get the hell out. So this was the temporary nature of the Western ethos, which is still very much part of Western ethos. This is where we get this huge idea of migration and mobility. The New England town, if you think of Williamsburg was not, people weren't planning on living there for 3 or 5 years and then getting out. Williamsburg was a permanent, settled, religious community that's supposed to be there for generations, and it was. This is a world that more accurately affects the world that modern Americans come from. This is a world where you go someplace, you make money, you go somewhere else. In this period, it was mining. Nowadays, it might getting a job with Google or some other company, Tesla down in Southern California. You move there for 5 years, work for them, and then get a job with someone else and move your home up to Seattle. So the idea of moving from one spot to the other to follow money, to follow a job, you might say, is very much part of this ethos, because everyone here was a migrant. Everyone here intentionalized and conceptualized themselves as a temporary migrant, temporarily living here long enough to make a success of themselves. Now, of course, the irony of all this was the vast majority of people here did nothing but lose money. The huge 99.9% of the people that are ever in Virginia City left it bankrupt. They never found that huge amount of money. They never found the mother lode. They never found success and fame and fortune. What little they had, they pretty much drunk away here. So what you get ironically is the guys that had the shops like these guys, they made out like bandits. But the folks that were actually doing the mining generally got screwed. So what you find though is Virginia City, like most of these places, pretty much vanishes. The entire town burned down a couple of times. Not surprisingly, it's all wood. And then people were very careless. People were very sloppy. Because you have to remember, this is a world of the individual. This is not a world of the group. It's not a world of the community. The people in this town, from any week to the next, you wouldn't know who was living in it because everyone, if they were successful, they left. If they were total failures, they might have to leave because they couldn't afford it anymore. So it's a transient community. It's a transient place. And so there's no sense of permanence here. And that's why you've got structures that look like this. This is a very impermanent place with very impermanent people. And so in that context, you're going to have little bits of New England. You're still going to have shutters in many cases because, you need to protect the glass. But in many cases, if you notice here, you don't have shutters. Why? Well, because you figure by the time if there's a storm, then you're just going to leave. You can take a hint. It's time to get out. So this is not a place where you worry about permanence. This is not a place where this isn't your future. This is your presence where, you're present where you basically are going to make money and then you're gone. Now, having said that, what you find is a few folks do try, for whatever reasons, especially, and most of these are much later buildings. These are pretty much put in the latter half of the 19th century. So they don't look it, but a lot of these places are actually from the 1920s, and I think these are all 1920s and 30s. I don't remember exactly, but a couple of these are a little older. Some of these up here, those date from the 1860s, 1870s. People who were shopkeepers down here that were making a lot of money would have a home up here for a while and then eventually sell it and then move to San Francisco or Denver or wherever they were going to go. But Denver was originally another one of these mining communities. Because you have to remember that mining communities took two forms. Mining was either digging stuff out of the ground, like deep pit mining or, gold and silver mining. But mining was also ranching. And then later mining becomes foresting. So, putting huge numbers of cattle or cutting down all the trees was another version of the same logic. You take from the landscape what you want, and then you get your ass out of here because you don't want to live here forever. I mean, you're only here for as long as you can be here to extract it, or you give up. So notice how you've got these cute little manifestations of New England. We don't have the shutters. We've lost those because these are modern. But you've still got the white picket fence. You've got classic Virginia City, what I call dirt lawns, which are very typical of gold mining towns. The water's scarce. There's very little water in Virginia City, so no one's going to waste their time with a pond. If you notice, there's almost nothing in the way of vegetation, except stuff that grows there naturally, little pinyon pine growing there. So this is all still very transient, but it's very much sort of this Western concept. So the false fronts, the bare wood, the sort of very minimalistic way of dealing with Mother Nature, because you're not really worried about permanence. And to a large extent, you're not really worried about what your neighbors think. You're not worried about your neighbors in the sense of permanent neighbors because you don't have any permanent neighbors. You're not going to be there permanently. Your neighbors aren't going to be there permanently. So everything is basically pretense, because what you're doing is you're setting yourself up so the guys, the newbies, the folks that are new to town, will see this and be impressed with it. They won't notice the false front. They'll just see the nice looking front of this place. A lot of the places we were involved a little bit in the early restoration work when they were trying to restore it in the 70s. And it was a nightmare because a lot of these places like this sucker, this was never intended to be permanent. So, the wood construction is poor. You had, basically it's brick, but the bricks weren't mortared properly. It was not a stable foundation, not to mention the tunnels underneath. So in the 20th century, the National Park Service was trying to basically make something permanent that was as temporary as a fairgrounds, and it's been a huge task for them to do that. But what you get is everything here was designed to strike the temporary, to impress the new person. And so everything becomes visual display. So for example, you have these very fancy railings here. You have all these porticos. They serve no function. The rails, yeah, but these portico trims they're not holding the roof up at all. Again, you see the same thing over here. If you notice, all this trim and this stuff is supposed to make the place snifty. It's the same way that most construction is done now, especially if you go to someplace like Waikiki. You're not interested in the reality of it. It's the image of place that becomes key. This looks like a movie set. It's been a ton of movie sets, and that's because that's the Western world. The Western world is a movie set. It's all intended to make temporary impacts because no one's going to be there long enough to worry about the permanence of place. So this is the second of our American landscapes, the classic landscape like this. Now, this one's a little bit interesting because there's a direct corollary of it somewhere else. Let's see that just quickly here. But switch out. One of the other places that is entirely, again, a migrant community, you have a very similar ethos. It's different, but it's a very similar ethos to the United States of Australia. Again, what you have is large Europeans from the same area. They're not as Calvinist. So you don't have the Calvinist Puritan New England spin to this. This is much later because Australia is settled in the early 19th century, so a good 200 years after their American counterpart. But what you get is very much the same ethos. It's people are leaving Europe, specifically England and then British Isles, but also other areas, for a new life. So it's a migrant-only community. They trash the Aborigines even worse than the Native Americans get wiped, especially because 200 later you have less of an excuse, I suppose. But the end result is the same. So what you have is a European ethos brought down to a other part of the world. In Australia's case, because there's the environmental jump, if you would, between the European world and the Australian world is much greater than the European world to the North American world. But the end result is, among other things, is mineral extraction was and still is a huge part of the Australian ethos, even more so than the United States. The United States, between oil and minerals and stuff, so, extraction is still a huge industry. But in Australia, it basically is the only industry. Coal, iron, the huge reserves in the western region. But what you had, especially by the mid-late 19th century, was, again, the same thing as North America. You had gold rushes and silver rushes, mainly gold, I think. And this is one of the gold rush towns from New South Wales in Australia, called Broken Hill, which is a very American name. In fact, there's a ton of Broken Hill, now abandoned communities in North America. And if you look at it, many of these folks actually were American miners that when the next big rush was, they didn't care where it was. If it was in China, they would go there, I suppose. But the large number of them ended up in Australia, becoming miners in Australia. Large numbers of them ended up staying there. So what you basically got, if you notice this, it's different construction materials because you didn't have any wood in this part of Australia, pretty much. So you had to use stucco and bricks and stuff. But other than that, you could put this down in Virginia City or any other mining community in North America, you wouldn't notice any differences. It's built the same way. It's a little bit later. It's been remodeled more, but you've got the same false fronts, the same sort of superficial pretense, the lack of interest in sort of the New England stuff, lack of fences, lack of this, lack of that. In part because, remember, Australians didn't have the Calvinist theme going. Didn't have public education in Australia until much later, for example. But the similarities are really fascinating. And a lot of the ethos of the two places, especially in terms of the disposal aspects of nature, that nature's purpose is to provide mineral extraction and wealth to populations. All of that is very, very similar. And not surprisingly, their environmental issues and social issues they're dealing with today are very similar because they pretty much got not the same. The mindsets are so close as to be sort of scary. But again, what you see is this idea of the temporary, transient world that is very much in the American and Australian context, also of the, if you would, the alternative to permanence. The interesting thing is one variation is, I think, because they're more of an English, clear society, is that Australians aren't as prone to moving around as Americans are. So Australians do not move homes every 3 to 5 years. And I think it's more like just a couple of times in their lifetime. So that's actually much more European than the American, transience, which is pretty surrealistic, peculiar American.